Happy Nikos News Day, everybody. This is Jonathan Albin, host here on Nikos RPG. And there's a board game store that is very near and dear to my heart. And this show's title is indirectly based on, I don't know, maybe the name of the store is Just Another Day in Paradise. But we're actually talking about Just Another Day in Nikos News Day. And today we have a lot to talk about. We are not going to spend a lot of time on Nikos property today because that's still in the final stages before we actually announce the beginning of the pre-release stage of Nikos RPG. We haven't yet gotten to the point where we're ready to kick off the project, so to speak. So we will leave that news for another day, but we will say that the master book is in the final stages of editing before we actually look at doing layout. So I'm pretty excited about that. So we're going to leave the story of Just Another Day in Nikos. Today's episode will actually be featuring a country that hasn't been visited by, it's been visited by one group of enjoined in the last year or so. And so we'll talk about that and other features of that location here in a minute. But before we get there, I want to thank you for being able to watch the show. And if you haven't been with us before, welcome. We talk about role-playing in every possible light. And in particular, we speak about the juxtaposition between role-playing as it was before Nikos RPG and since Nikos RPG has developed. So we will go into that information for you as well and let you know what's going on with that. Before we get there, I do want to make sure that you know that if you are interested in being a participant, you can join with us at the game store Board Game Paradise on Monday nights and Tuesday nights. Both those start at 6 p.m. and we run until roughly 10 o'clock p.m., give or take 10-15 minutes, depending on how that goes. And generally, those are set in the world of Nikos in the 9th iteration, which is modern era, and are contemporaneous adventures, and their locations sometimes crisscross. So we have actually had a couple of crossover episodes already, and we've got some players that are doing some hijinks as well, so we'll go into some of that perhaps when we get to talking about all of that. Now, those updates will be tonight. Nikos News Day, Nikos Nightly News at 11 p.m. Pacific time. We will be talking about all things adventure and bring you up to date on what is going on with each of the named adventures that are currently going on in the world of Nikos. But this morning we want to talk about, in particularly, one of the nations of the world of Nikos, and the nation we're going to talk about today is the enchanting land of Bylos. We'll talk about where it is, what goes on there, and a lot of information that will pertain to that realm in terms of its place in the timeline of Nikos as well, chronologically from its original, the first forays into visiting that location, all the way through to the modern iteration and what's going on there now. So let's start this off by showing you the map, and we are talking of the nation over here on the far coast of Yarland. As I've mentioned before, 3 continents: Growland, which is this expansive one here in this to the the left side of your screen, and then Norlum, which is this area up in the northern part where my charming little face is. Hi. And then down below, this is Yallen, and Yallen has several different countries on it, but today we're going to be talking about this large expanse of basically unmapped territory known as Bylos. Alrighty, so current day, the only city of any note in the continent, the country of Bylos, is Canaveral, which is ironically not a city of the nation. It is actually a protectorate provided to their neighbors, known as the Mir. We'll go into those in a separate episode, more than likely, when we start talking about the species of Nikos, or the races of Nikos. But at this point, just know that the nation of Bylos is only represented on the map by the city of Canaveral, because that is the only place that the adventurers have actually had named adventures. We've had a couple of encounters in some of those areas, and we'll go into that as well. But let's talk first of all about the history. We'll come back and look at the map again later as we need to. All right, and I need to. All right. So, the nation of Bylos. Of course, its name has changed over time. It was originally christened as Babyl, Babyl, and the name is based on the ancient city of Babylon on Earth. It was named originally New Babylon by the denizens thereof, who were a mortal population way back in the third iteration. And in the third iteration, as you may recall, the world's conflict was surrounding the nature and essence of the newly discovered species that were fundamentally the offspring, and I use that term lightly, of the Daemon, Daemon, who had been summoned to Nikos by the adventurers at the end of the second iteration. As you may recall, when we've talked about the iterational issues, the second iteration's focus had been on trying to find a way home for the Terran population. They have rapidly advanced in the end of the first iteration, and at the beginning of the second, it was nearly wiped out by a horrible plague, and the majority population were either dead or sickly, and there were concerns over the very health of the planet indeed, because although they'd been sickly and whatever, there had been a roughly 500-year period after the beginning of the second iteration where the human population had been extremely fecund and had really done everything it could, and that word I use was just fecund, Fecund. Calm down, it wasn't what you thought you heard. The fecund population, the burgeoning and expansive, if you will, human population had reached to fundamentally the four corners of the map of the world, and their collective might had been a great concern for the other species of Nikos, the other races, in particular the Eldarin, who had been basically the masters of all they surveyed throughout the first iteration, the human population being hosted, if you will, by the first peoples. They, because of their expansion and their ultimate division here on Nikos, had entertained the idea of going into a war with humanity for just out of fear that the humans would dominate all biospheres, if you will, all possible areas of the world of Nikos, and literally would have driven the other species into uh, elimination, if not isolation and destruction. But in that second iteration, the purpose began, and the purpose began with only 6 stanzas. Someone will have to actually go back and visit the iteration to see whether or not they can actually glean what were the particular objectives of that iteration compared to the now rather expansive, I think it's 5 stanzas of the modern purpose, but we'll go into that in a little bit. The concept of the purpose, as you may recall, is a checklist or a countdown of the things that must occur within an iteration for it to reach its terminus, its conclusion. The world literally can't restart, if you will, if the players don't endeavor to find a way to make that happen, to bring the conclusion to all of the parts and parcels of that iteration to a close. And so, since it was much shorter, the concept would be it would take a lot less time. But in reality, the issue was at that time, transitionally, in my personal life, we were averaging about a move every 6 months or so as a kid. And so the adventures that I ran were much more staccato. They were isolated pieces of the purpose. And so each time I would start a new group, it would fundamentally be to take on another one of these iterational artifacts. And so there were basically 6 to 10 of them within that period of time. And therefore, the progress of the iteration was very dependent on which stories could be told with which players involved and how I could weave them together to still reach the conclusion in that amount of time. So, with that in mind, let's look at some of the information that we need to know about Bylos. Let me go back to the map and we'll talk a little bit about its geography. All right, although you really can't see it on the map because the iterational investigation hasn't done any research yet in the kingdom of Bylos. Bylos, as you see, is similar to Mentara in that it's a city-state, a kingdom, if you will, supported by its capital. And in this case, we can't see the capital of Bylos because no one's been there yet. So at this point, Canaveral is acting as its ersatz capital because we haven't yet investigated the actual locale. But Bylos, as in the case of all previous city-states that we've talked about, is itself a isolated kingdom, a fortified location. Its actual capital is named Babel still, Babyl, and the capital of Bylos therefore is associated with the ancient city. There are the ruins of an ancient tower that was created in that time frame. Now remember, I did say that the mortals were trying to find their way home. The world of Nikos was inhospitable at that time. There were challenges with the human physiology and the interaction with the world of Nikos, which we may talk of at some point in the future, in that there were major diseases called siphons, and they have not been experienced in literally iterations because people have not delved into the history or the depths under the city of Babel. So without that impetus, therefore the most horrible of plagues on the world of Nikos simply aren't going to happen. At least perhaps not. We will see. Now that I've said it, now that I've called for it, there may be groups that actually decide they want to discover this location, explore its depths, and perhaps defeat and destroy the siphons forever. They are still, in theory, dormant in that area because for the past 4 or 5 iterations, those persons that passed by the area of Bylos never actually engaged with the peoples thereof. Now there are a couple of areas that are in this general vicinity that have not been engaged with, that are rather interesting, and I am not going to go into those because there's no reason to introduce you to an alternate species yet, but we haven't, as I said, visited there in a long time. And the climate of Bylos and this region in particular, in general, is that this entire valley fundamentally operates sort of like the Indus Valley on Earth, in that it is verdant along the mountain ranges and the limited lakes and oases in the midst of the kingdom. But other than that, it's a dry savanna-like property. The possibility for agriculture is extremely high. At times in the past, there have been extremely massive fields, and the closest we got to a connection with the valleys of Bylos in the past iteration were when the enjoined made contact with the Thrin, a insect species that is known for their harvesting and threshing capabilities, and they had massive food production that was started here in support of those people that were being affected by the swarming last time around. Now, we haven't talked about the swarms yet this iteration, and perhaps we won't. Promises were made, and the priest kings are endeavoring to keep their part in terms of maintaining a peaceful relationship between the priest kings species, which some players have already sussed out that the Yarlum species, of which the continent Yarlum was originally named, and the mortal population, they have been at peace for more than 300 years. That is, since before this iteration officially was triggered. And the other, pardon me, the other issue of the climate here is that the rolling thunderstorms are said to be the most fantastic to be seen here. So when you think of the Indus Valley, you can also consider the American Great Plains area, because the mountain range, the Silver Blades, breaks the continent very nearly in half. And because of its existence, the western half of the continent fundamentally draws the majority of the rainfall, as indicated by the great forests around the capital of Barbas in Penza on the eastern coast, which of course will be a separate episode at some point in the future. But let's go through iterationally what the nation of Bylos has faced. So, as I mentioned, in the beginning of the second iteration was the first time that human population was really acknowledged, and the first time a group of enjoined came to visit. And in that time period, the species differentiation across the continent had been pretty much overwhelmed by the human population. The familiarity of a large open plain, the concept of general and controlled irrigation meant that this was fundamentally a breadbasket, and that opening provided a huge opportunity for both individual farmers, sharecroppers, industrial farms in certain cases, and even along the edge of the blades, mining operations. For example, the initial location that later migrated, ironically, to Groenland by a replication. There was a area in the south of Bylos that was known as Blackstone Ridge. That area was when the nation of Moria became known as Neo Moria. The city-state of Moria replicated the names of the area of the Blackstone Ridge in honor of its similarities to the original Blackstone Ridge. And the operations of the great wizards Belden and Alistair, who are names that are pretty much replicated from history dating way back to the founding of Nikos. They were the key names of the locations in power during that period. But this time frame, the second iteration, humanity's expansion had not only been in the areas of planting and harvesting and mining, but it was actually the first of the ancient golden ages, if you will, of technology. And technomancy was in its infancy. It wasn't yet called that, but there were individuals who were building automata, later known as technomata, who were establishing workforces of large numbers of them during the second and towards the middle to the end of the second iteration. The lifestyle of humanity across the majority of the continent of Yalem was at its peak. There were great cities, there were transit systems, there were many different types of flying craft. It was kind of a heady time to be in existence at this point in time. Now, historically, this would have been in an actual chronological time frame. We're looking at the late 70s into the early 80s when this second iteration was occurring, and in that time frame, the things that appealed to people were, for example, the concept of hunting dragons. The idea was, in the Heights, we knew the dragons existed, and the adventuring party was wanting to set a precedent by literally hunting down at least one of each of the primary evil dragons. They were looking for the what they later called the chromatic dragons. And this is for the concept of the prism hadn't even been developed. That in that second iteration, the champions who had won had used the great items of power and had started to encapsulate that power and isolate it. And so by the end of the second iteration, the concept of the dream prism as a major device was being built, because the point was they were going to utilize this device, which was originally built and created not on Nikos. I'm going to tease that bit. The dream prism, the very focal energy sources that are used in all of technomancy from that point to the modern era, was based on this non-Terran technology. I'm not going to go into who developed it, because that would be far too juicy a tidbit to let slip in a video like this, but the realization that the dynamics of focal magic, that is technomancy, is not of Nicotian origin, although it was built here. That's a teaser bit I'm going to give, is that it was indeed built here, but it was not of Nicotian origin. Led the parties to Bylos. So this may be teasing a bit here, but while there wasn't yet a candle fall, there wasn't yet a hammer fall. This was, as I said, the end of the second iteration. This dream prism was located in the center of the continent of Yavin. I'll just leave that somewhere near the center. I wouldn't call it the epicenter yet, but fundamentally the center area of this kingdom, which would be the northern reaches of the Bylani Empire. Having said that, the adventurers spent a great amount of time looking into the first iteration's history and determining that the last of the first iteration kingdoms ended with the name King Sargon. I'm not going to provide any more information than that in this video because I don't want to muck it up for my groups or make them, drop what they're doing and pursue a new course simply because somebody found out. Having said that, the Dream Prism, as constructed, was initially activated in the upper reaches of North Bylos. It wasn't named that at the time, and there are plenty of resources that will give more information on that. This was in the time frame of the elevation of the people of Primus, as the Primus species came to its pinnacle. Its locations in the Silver Blades became synonymous with grace, power, and although they were not yet being involved in the activities of men, nonetheless, the men did deign to reach heights that they hadn't before. And so, more hints and clues I don't want to go fully into. Suffice it to say that by the time the second iteration is closing, the interconnection between the powerful weapons created by the results of the first iteration became interconnected with this new concept, this technomancy, and spawned the new legends of the Dream Prism itself. Its focus and purpose was to allow the Daemon to enter Nikos. You see, the difficulties and challenges were becoming more ardent as the dragons themselves were becoming more sophisticated, many of them reaching ancient status, the colossal size that is associated with the most powerful of dragon kind. They were establishing themselves along all of the mountain ranges, and the Eldrin forces finally realized that the more numerous humans would be useful. And so the connections between the mortal population and the Primus population reached its pinnacle. There were open borders between realms that have been sealed now for 6 iterations. The amount of interconnection meant that there were concerted forces ready to take on the the dragon kind issue. But as you know, human populations are innovative and want to find new ways to do things. And so by reaching out through the capture, shall we say, of the mystical power of this new device, the threat of the dragons was quelled fundamentally for the rest of all iterations. Granted, the dragons have had a couple of uprisings over the years, but they had reached their cap, their extent, around the same time as the Primus. So there may be some interesting lore to pursue there, to look into how those two powerful species were interconnected. Need I say more? Interesting story. But let's move on. So, at the end of this, however, there was, as usual, a great conflagration, a great elimination, and from second iteration, actually from the middle of the third iteration, for almost 2 iterations, this area of the western coast, the eastern coast of Yarland, became known as the Southron Wastes. Really, I don't have to say much more than that. The Southron Wastes are, there's so much lore that goes into that I can't go into all of it, but know that during the third iteration and the fourth iteration, there was an interconnection between the major cities of human population across the Balani Plain, that it was fundamentally, I guess you'd say chronologically, most directly associated with what we think of as the downshift rules, the downshift era. Now, granted, there were a couple of really important movies that came out in that time frame that, as we're going into the second and third iteration, we're talking about early 80s into the mid 80s. So you might have heard of movies like, I don't know, Mad Max, Road Warrior, Demolition Man, and several others. Basically, the concept of post-apocalypse came to Nikos in that time frame. Now, because the majority population had been mortal and most other nations weren't directly affected by the Southern Waste, many of the stories that were told in that time frame, and even many stories told in Downshift, only apply to human populations. So there's a lot of interesting things that can happen if you get involved or start playing. For example, in Downshift events, they actually, majority of them do occur in what is now the Southern Waste, or what was then the Southern Waste, which is now the nation of Bylos. So there's tons of Easter eggs there to be pursued. Legends of the last of the V8s actually originated in the Southern Wastes. There are said to be, well, I don't want to go into all the details. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of surprises in Bylos for those that might be interested in that earlier age. Now, from the middle of the fourth iteration forward, up until the 8th iteration, there are very few tales of the Bylani Empire, the people of Bylos. As a matter of fact, they were lost in time completely during the 7th iteration. And then the Act of the Revening destroyed whatever was left, because the other populations of the world didn't keep track of the Southern Wastes, and their return to a verdancy we can only attribute to the Pamphlicites and the Thrin, which are species we've talked about before. And when I start doing my dives into the Enchiridion, we'll go into a lot more detail on the creatures, beings, and monsters of the world of Nikos. But suffice it to say that the Pamphlocite population sacrificed itself considerably to overpopulate the Bylani Valley again and bring it back to its verdancy. There are a lot of stories about how that happened, which haven't yet been discovered. So we have to see whether or not they're found in the 9th iteration or not. The existence of the purpose has now been granted to all of the campaigns of Nikos. So if you are a participant in those campaigns and are not familiar with it, ask around and check the Discord for your channel and see whether or not you have a copy of it. I do know that it's been provided to each of the campaigns, but they may not actually still have that active. We'll talk about that somewhat tonight. I'm about completed on the information that I wanted to carry forward for this iterational tale, but I do want to add a few more things about Bylos. The origin, for example, of the stories of the Black Book of Adam happen to have started initially in the Bylos and on the Bylani Plains during the period of the Southern Wastes, a reliquary of sorts, a resource collection facility there, without saying any more, was where the first of the Black Books was actually uncovered as an item, as a relic of history. Later versions were brought into the game by players throughout the 4th, 5th, and 6th, but in that initial dark phase, when the Southern Wastes were new, the first explorers dug up, unearthed doesn't sound right, unnikosed the first of these documents, and it did cause a rather interesting program, which led to the isolation of a species, and that species has only been seen as individual specimens in the 8th iteration, so few people know anything about that country. So there is a centralized country in this area who are known in history, so therefore there will be documentation and stories about it to be found that have to do with this specific species, who became the champions and defenders of that older version of the book. So realize that if you are a seeker, you will be spending time eventually in the Bylani Plains looking for this species. But I don't want to give away much more than that without ruffling any feathers. But if you do have any questions about this, you can find out more at nikosrpg.info. That is our lore dump. It's the website known as World Anvil. It's my access point to that. And as a Lifetime Sage member, that data will be there ad infinitum. If you want to know more information about the Nikos RPG system, the Fast Play version, the first iteration of the Fast Play version, is available right now at nikosrpg.com as a download. There are persona sheets there. There is the newly developed CIS that we talked about 2 weeks ago. And all the resources that you need to actually start playing and running in the world of Nikos are both there right now. So if you want additional information and you want to become a part of our community, we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/Nikos, where we're actually building the world, and we will be starting as I said, the beginnings of the kickoff for that in the near future. As it is, the master book, as I mentioned, is in final edit stage and preparing for layout. So we are getting really close for the launch of Nikos. So if you have any retailers that you know that are currently not carrying Nikos, which would be all of them but Board Game Paradise, have them reach out to me or reach out to me on your own behalf, and I will get you information on order and distribution, and the possibilities of the stores getting advanced copies of the pre-release version. Now, this will be the version with no adornment. This will be just the facts, ma'am, the rules of the game, and all of the stuff necessary to write and run role-play games in the world of Nikos in a general sense. The master book covers everything you need to know about playing in the world of Nikos, also how to build creatures, build monsters, and how to actually administer games. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I am glad you were with me for this session, and I hope to see you again in the next time. Watch for us tonight at 11 p.m. because the Nikos Nightly News is going to get really exciting tonight. We've got some great stuff coming from Strangers in the Strange Land, from the Voyages of the Ark and Eye. These are the no, I'm said that wrong. Heralds of the Change and Voyages of the Ark and Eye. Those are the adventures that are on the weekend that are played by the members of my Patreon account. So if you want to be a participant, you merely join the Patreon account at any level, and then we will reach out to you and provide you with access to all of the benefits through Discord for our live stream games. And then on top of that, or live stream, we're not recording them yet. We're just running the stories online. Getting ahead of myself there, too. Hint, hint. And then finally, that'll also include the stories of Strangers in the Strange Land, which is our Monday night game. The Skiffborn, which is our Tuesday game, and then ultimately also the Roleplay Roulette, which is we're only in our second week, and that's our special events at the game store, Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California, at 2 p.m. Pacific time. If you've never played a role-play game before, this is a great way to learn. It takes 5 minutes. I'm kidding you not. There are 5 to 8 minutes, and you can be playing. So join us at Board Game Paradise on Saturdays for Role-Play Roulette. Fundamentally, we spin a wheel, quite literally, and that chooses for us the genre that we're going to play, and people build their characters in 5 minutes, and we're up and rolling because I've written the adventure in that same 5 minutes. So feel free to join us in that case on Saturday games. Otherwise, I will see you in the next appointed time, which will be tonight at 11 p.m. I do have a game today, 6 p.m. Skiffborn, Nikos RPG at Board Game Paradise. And this has been just another day in Bylos, not just another day in Nikos. Wrong one. Wrong button. Here we go. Just another day in Nikos. I hope to see you again next time. I'm eventually going to get these buttons down. It'll be seamless. I promise. Really will. All right. This is Nikos. This is Jonathan Albin, and I will see you next time.